Good morning, everybody. Today is Monday, December 7th of 2020. This is our third and final day of note taking for Unit 3. Over the past few lectures, we've been talking about the different series of laws, taxations, and events that were happening between the colonists and Great Britain. We talked about the sugar, the stamps, the Townshend Act, took time to look at the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. Today, we are going to be looking at what follows after Great Britain passes the Intolerable Acts, which follow the Boston Tea Party. As you watch the lecture video today, make sure you copy down the slides that are shown, and then if you need to, pause the video if I'm moving too fast. Once you've finished, you are going to complete your note check activity before checking out with me to end the period. So today, we're going to start talking about the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress is going to take place in September of 1774, a few months following the passing of the Intolerable Acts in March that same year. Out of the 13 original colonies, only 12 of them are going to send representatives to Philadelphia to attend the First Congress. The reason why Georgia is not going to send delegates is because they are currently fighting the Creek Native Americans, and they are relying heavily on the British soldiers to fight the war for them. So they decide to sit this one out so they're not stirring the pot against their allies in the war against the Creeks. The main deal was that they want to figure out a way that they can bring peace with Great Britain and kind of go back to how things were. You're going to have some individuals that are going to be radicals, like Patrick Henry, for example, who was going to deliver a series of fiery speeches comparing the colonists and the colonies as slaves to Great Britain. And the only way for them to get back their liberty that they've lost is to go to war. Throughout one of his first speeches he gives, he ends it with the famous saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." Patrick Henry is just one of the 56 individuals that is going to attend the First Continental Congress. Half of them are going to be lawyers. A lot of them are going to be predominant throughout the colonies, like George Washington. But you're also going to have some lesser known individuals like John Jay from the colony of New York. An individual like Patrick Henry is also known as a patriot. During this time period, there's really two sets of people. You have your patriots, who are individuals that are going to want to fight for their independence and break away from Great Britain. On the other hand, you're going to have the loyalists, who are going to remain loyal to the British Crown and hope that they're able to bring peace between the colonies and the home country of Great Britain. So the main goal of the Congress was to figure out how they can bring peace. We're not really looking for a way to end the relationship. We're just looking on trying to get some counseling if we're looking at it like a relationship standpoint. So the first idea that they're going to continue with is they are going to continue to boycott British goods. They're going to stop the importation of those British goods, ranging from raw materials, maybe textiles, all the way up to slaves. If there's British goods already in the markets, we are going to promise not to buy those goods because that will benefit the British economy. We're going to set up little committees throughout the colonies to make sure individuals are following the boycott. If not, they're going to be publicly harassed and embarrassed, sometimes exiled, just to get their point across as to this is a unified effort and we want things to get back down to the way it was. They're also going to agree to, for a little bit, stop the exportation of rice and tobacco from the colonies to Great Britain. After they leave the First Continental Congress, they agreed that rice and tobacco are very important for the economy of the South. So they're going to allow the southern colonies have the opportunity to export their major cash crop. The second is that they are going to continue to prepare for war using their local militias. These militias were just citizens, average day folk who had a job and a family that took time out of their own schedule to learn how to shoot a gun, reload it, clean it, and learn basic military tactics. The idea of militias first started to protect the colonies from the nearby Native American attacks. But now we're going to turn these average colonists into a fighting force that is going to have to go up against the British before the end of 1775. The third was that they are going to draft the Declaration of Rights. This is really a list of 10 resolutions that they would like to be solved, and they're going to send this to the British King, King George III. It's just a list of complaints that the colonists have formed ever since the Stamp Act, kind of voicing the same idea of the no taxation without representation. They really want the Intolerable Acts to be getting rid of, and they really want to get all the taxes kind of reduced to nothing like it was at the start of the colonial time period. So after doing those three major things, they are going to send the Declaration of Rights along with two other congressional letters to King George III in hopes that he is going to read them and maybe agree with what they're saying or kind of find a room to compromise in order to bring peace. The goal was that they were going to meet again in 1775 if King George III does not request or meet their demands, and that's something that we're going to have to look at here towards the end of our lecture. Part of the Intolerable Acts from last week after the Boston Tea Party was that they shut down the Boston Harbor. They made Massachusetts a royal colony. In doing so, King George III appointed General Thomas Gage to become governor of Massachusetts. He's really going to inflict the idea of martial law, and he's going to use the force of the British troops to kind of police the colonists, in Boston, but also throughout the entire colony of Massachusetts. As he is the governor, he's going to rely heavily on his intel that he receives from loyalists and spies. Spying during the American Revolution is a pretty well-known thing, and we'll talk more about that towards the end of this week. He gets a letter from King George III in which King George III wants Mr. Thomas Gage to go out and capture two radicals, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, but also to seize a stockpile of weapons that were being collected by the colonists. The colonists were raiding, nearby British forts for, a few supplies like firearms, muskets, rifles. Sometimes they had big cannons, but for the most part, they're stockpiling firearms. So the goal was that on April 18th, he is going to send roughly 700 British troops to Barrett's Farm, which is the location that the Patriots were stockpiling these weapons just in case war was going to be announced. So with the stockpiling weapons in Concord, this is where we're going to see Paul Revere kind of go through his famous ride. So Paul Revere was a patriot. He was in the visual that made that image about the Boston Massacre, in which it was called the Bloody Massacre, perpetrated on King Street. So during this time, he's now a messenger, and he was kind of spying or just constantly monitoring the activity of the British troops in and around Boston. He finds out information, at about 9:30, 10 o'clock, that the British were possibly going to make their way from Boston all the way to Concord, where those weapons were being stockpiled. His goal was that he is going to have friends working in the Old North Church that are going to hang lanterns up on the windows or in the steeps to kind of alert the rest of the riders. One if by land, two if by sea. Paul Revere gets all the credit for his midnight ride, though he actually never sees the actual lanterns. It was mostly used for backup riders. Paul Revere is actually captured throughout his midnight ride, and the other individuals like Prescott and William Dawes kind of have a lot more responsibility of alerting the local militias to take up arms to fight against the British as they get closer to Lexington and Concord. So Revere, William Dawes, and Prescott rode to warn the colonists. The famous saying, the British are coming. They're not going to be yelling throughout the town that the British are coming. They're going to alert key leaders within these local towns to get their militias ready. just because you really don't know who is a patriot and who is a loyalist. Here's a map of kind of the ride that takes place. Uh, William Dawes leaves Boston around 9:30. Paul Revere leaves Boston around 10. Kind of ride throughout the countryside, alerting local militias. And then it's actually not until 2 a.m. That the British soldiers actually leave Boston to march to Lexington and Concord. At about 5 a.m., the British troops are met outside of Lexington. It's about 7 to 10 miles outside of Concord, and they are greeted by roughly 70 Minutemen. These Minutemen are just local militias that were ready to fight in a minute's notice, hence the term Minutemen. So the 70 Minutemen are heavily outnumbered against the Redcoats that marched roughly 700 troops from Boston to get to Concord. The Minutemen are actually going to be led by an individual named John Parker. He was a French and Indian War veteran, so he has that military background. As they're kind of in a standoff in the middle of the field, John Parker tells his crew, "Stay in your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. If they mean for war, let it happen here." And after a brief moment of silence and uncertainty, a gunshot is going to be fired. Even today, nobody knows from which side. It is known as the shot heard around the world. The reason why it's called that is because every European nation was well aware of the relationship between the colonists and Great Britain, and everyone was watching eagerly to see what was going to happen. So as soon as that first shot is fired, everyone in the European sphere kind of has an idea that there's going to be war and the possibility for Great Britain to lose its money-making colonies. The fighting doesn't take very long here at Lexington. You were going to see roughly 8 individuals killed, 10 were wounded. The militia was forced to retreat as the Redcoats continue marching onto Concord. The British are going to arrive at Concord, but they're going to realize that the weapons have already been removed. For the most part, the colonists were able to get out all the firearms. There were a few cannons that were too heavy to move and too hard to hide that were left behind. So the Redcoats were going to destroy those. Upon realizing that all the supplies is gone, the Redcoats or the British are going to make that long 20-mile march all the way back to Boston. But after the events at Lexington, the local militias were able to take up arms to kind of start harassing the Redcoats as they make their way from Concord all the way to Boston. So we have a couple hundred to a few thousand individuals that are going to kind of harass the Redcoats or the British as they make their way through. So as they pass along the North Ridge or the North Bridge, we're going to see the colonists kind of start popping out and utilizing the idea of guerrilla warfare, really using the landscape as cover and executing very precise hit and run attacks on your opponents. The Redcoats are going to be harassed for the entire 20 miles back to Boston, as the militias, not only from Lexington and Concord and other areas throughout Massachusetts, are going to harass them until they're able to get back to Boston. For the most part, 15 straight miles of constant chaos and constant fire. And then once they get to Boston, they kind of get back to the barracks and are able to regroup. The colonists were able to inflict easy casualties on the Redcoats just because of their bright red jackets, hence the term Redcoats. As they are making their way back, the colonists are going to kill or wound roughly 250 British soldiers. In return, the colonists are only going to use 90. The events that take place at Lexington and Concord is really the first battle that we're going to see in the American Revolution. And we'll spend a little bit more time looking at primary sources to figure out actually who shot first, if we're able to do that. May 5th, 1775 is when we start to reorganize the Second Continental Congress. Again, the goal was to meet again in 1775 if the demands of the Declaration of Rights was not met by King George III. King George III and Parliament were actually working on a counter to kind of address those Declaration of Rights. They wanted to give them a chance to not pay for taxes if they're able to protect themselves, and then kind of pay for their own civil and judicial kind of government roles. But before they were able to actually send back a response, the events at Lexington and Concord happened, which really eliminates the chance of peace. So within the Second Continental Congress, we're going to have major newcomers like John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson are all going to attend to kind of help navigate the next steps. King George III actually refuses the Declaration of Rights in regards to meeting everything that they demanded, but they were interested in making a compromise. But again, the events at Lexington and Concord forbids that. So now that the 13 colonies are all going to some representation, Georgia no longer needs the redcoats to fight the war, but also that agreement that if one colony was under attack, the rest of the colonies will come to its aid. They're going to meet at the wonderful place of Independence Hall. Independence Hall is the Pennsylvania State Building. It's known for really housing the First Continental Congress, housing the de facto government throughout the American Revolution. It was actually the place in which the Constitution Convention was held, and it was also used as a display or a memory of Abraham Lincoln. After Lincoln is executed out inside of Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., his body is then transported from D.C. back to Springfield, Illinois. It makes a stop here at Independence Hall, in which roughly 300,000 people were able to visit and pay their respects for the fallen president of Mr. Lincoln. So back on topic. While we're here in the Second Council of the Congress, we're going to just figure out ways that we are going to address the situation that happened not only in the first Congress, but also what happened at Lexington and Concord. The resolutions of the Congress are as followed. So they agreed that they're going to have to ramp up because war is basically approaching after the events at Lexington and Concord. That's kind of an important thing. That's why I keep saying it over and over again. The Massachusetts militia is going to transform into the Continental Army. We'll have roughly 15,000 individuals make out the Continental Army. We'll have a group of 6 companies of marksmen that are going to be used throughout the frontier. And then we're going to start building a 2-ship navy, all using local militias to really ramp up the war effort once that declaration of war is declared. The second is that George Washington was going to be named the General of the Army. There were other individuals to consider that served in the British, but also in the French and Indian War. But those individuals are too old and are experiencing health problems. So that really only left George Washington. He had that military background during the French and Indian War. He has a great character about himself. He has a very tall and strong presence. So he was a no-brainer once the other candidates were unable to serve. The last piece was that they were going to try to make one more attempt to bring peace. They kind of offered the Olive Branch petition, very similar to the Declaration of Rights. They're still complaining about taxes and the other acts, but they're really pleading for a way to bring peace to, make the colonies in Great Britain great again. But unfortunately for them, King George III is going to refuse to read this letter. He's going to declare the colonies in a state of rebellion, and we're going to see a lot more redcoats make its way to the 13 colonies. That's our notes for the American Revolution. Just talked about some of the key events that led up to the actual fighting for the independence. For the rest of this week, we're going to look at who shot first at Lexington and Concord using primary sources. We'll get into some of the strengths and weaknesses for the Americans and the British in the war. We'll look at the Declaration of Independence. And then on Friday, we'll start talking about a project in which you can research an important person, a key battle, or other topics. Once you get this copied down, make sure you complete your note check and then check out with me.